Lioness Among Lions, the controversial election of Wyoming's first female governor. Nellie Tayloe Ross was the first woman to be inaugurated governor in not only Wyoming, but the entire United States. A photograph from the Wyoming State Archives regarding the inauguration depicts the scene. January 5, 1925. This was the day American women would have the doors so recently closed to them be blown wide open, providing opportunity from inspiration. The moment captured in the photograph reveals Nellie Tayloe Ross, the newly elected governor of Wyoming, standing behind a desk in the governor's office. Her superiors and comrades stood with mixed emotions shown on their faces: joy, excitement, fear, fondness, pride, and respect. In the photo, everyone else in the room was surrounding Nellie as she was seated behind the desk. With her pen in her right hand, she signed the oath of office that not only solidified her position as the governor of Wyoming, but also as a role model for many women. Nellie Tayloe Ross's election was a great accomplishment. However, many believe her success was actually attributed to the death of her late husband, the previous governor, and the sympathy votes from his supporters. A woman running for a political position was very unpopular at this time. Existing in the midst of controversy, Nellie Ross had to face many obstacles during and after the election. Examining sexism and socially constructed gender roles in the 1920s exposes a complex and controversial debate regarding the election of Nellie Tayloe Ross. Born on November 29, 1876, in St. Joseph, Montana, Nellie grew up on a plantation. She was an educated girl who later went to college to become a teacher, then went on to teach elementary for the next 4 years before moving to Wyoming, where she met her husband, William Ross. Nellie and William were very close. He saw her not only as a wife, but as a friend and an equal to be respected. Nellie and William got married in the year 1902 and were together 22 years before his death. In the 1920s, it was still less common to see women in relationships where the man would regard her opinion just as highly as any man's, even in Wyoming. Wyoming is known as the equality state. It got its name because they were the first to legalize women's rights to vote. Before, of course, June 4th, 1919, when Congress passed the amendment. This event makes Nellie's election that much more influential. And thanks to the relationship she and William shared and the many discussions between them, she was no stranger to politics. And when William died on October 2nd, 1924, there were hundreds that mourned his death, and Nellie believed that the only way to properly honor his memory was to run for the office that he left behind. Nellie was convinced to run in the election for Wyoming governor almost immediately following his death. In fact, it was at his funeral that she was approached by Dr. J. Hilton, the chairman of the Wyoming Democratic Committee. There was only little over a month for all of the candidates to promote themselves and start gathering votes. But Nellie won the election and became the first woman in history to be put into office as governor in the United States. But keep in mind, during the same election, a woman named Miriam A. Ferguson also ran for governor in Texas and was also elected into office. However, Nellie's day of inauguration was just 15 days before Miriam's, making Nellie the first by a technicality. Both elections were great accomplishments for women, but there is still much to accomplish for women's rights and equality. Many of the primary research demonstrates the citizens' feelings towards Nellie Ross's election, both positive and negative. And even though this was a major turning point for women in the workforce, there were still many men and women against the idea of a female governor. Of course, with great accomplishment always comes great controversy. Many people attributed Nellie's success to the election due to the passing of her late husband, and that people's sympathy over William's death gave Nellie the push that she needed to win the election. As well as examples from newspapers at the time, there were also countless documents, interviews, correspondence papers, and also articles written by Nellie herself about her experiences. examples from the secondary research explain the differences between sexism and gender roles, as well as the impact Nellie's election had on the world. The claims that Nellie only won due to pity can be refuted by taking a look at the two most prevalent theories from the research: sexism and socially constructed gender roles. The controversy lies with whether or not these theories were involved in Nellie's being elected. Looking at the research will help to see if Nellie worked hard for her election and earned it through the dedication, or, argumentatively, that the election was won solely through the sympathy from her voters. The first theme prevalent in this controversy is the theme of socially constructed gender roles. This would best be defined as the aspects in which a specific gender is supposed to fill or assimilate in order to fit in with their society. These roles are fabricated by the society to show the guidelines in which both men and women must follow. Socially constructed gender roles are also known to adapt and change based on the location, era, and many other factors. The same can be said for the second theory, sexism. Sexism is the act of prejudice and bias towards someone specifically based on their gender, as per a lecture in the American Women History course taught by historian Dr. Jessica Clark at the WWCC. Sexism, too, can be seen as a much more complex theme than is believed. There can be other factors that contribute to sexism, and refers to both men and women. These two terms can also correlate. In history, one is usually not seen without the other. Because it is hard to understand sexism without examples of socially constructed gender roles, the latter must be addressed first. If a woman steps out of her expected place in society, many people, men and women, react in a negative way. An example that shows some of the gender roles in the 1920s and the reaction society had to Nellie's defying them would be one man, unnamed in the article, going so far as to say that he believed a woman's place is in the kitchen and at home. They can raise children and care for the family. This man believed that there was no other way for a woman to be happy. This was not an uncommon belief in the 20th century America. Most families, according to an article, women included, they were expected to become a wife, have children, keep the house clean, maintain a polite and quiet attitude, and men were expected to go to work, provide for the family, etc. Nellie Tayloe Ross defied these socially constructed gender roles by striving for and taking up a position of political power. A leadership position most people viewed as a man's job. In an interview with Nellie Tayloe Ross, she stated herself about how she hadn't even realized the potential she held. She told the interviewer that she hadn't even realized that she had a place outside of her home, let alone in a political position of power. The second theory, sexism, shows itself many times throughout Nellie's election. There are many cases documented in which people would have spoke out against the idea of a woman governor. Many did not like the idea of a woman in a position of power. People develop resentment or fear towards a person that leaves their defined gender roles, and they tend to focus that resentment towards their gender. Nellie experienced sexism all throughout her run for office. Not only then, but also after she was elected as well. There are several accounts of attacks at her seat during the term because of their disdain towards a woman being in office. Her foes created a catalog of records that were falsified in order to sabotage the governor. These records showed raising of taxes for personal benefits, malicious behavior towards her friends, and the disdain towards ex-service members. These accusations were all proven false, but they demonstrate the lengths at which some will go to see her out of office. Another example from the Cheyenne State Leader is an article titled, "Two Parties to Nominate Next Tuesday, Hasty State Conventions Called to Name Men." The article hardly mentions the announcement of Nellie running for office, but focuses intently on the other men announcing their runs, as if they do not believe it is necessary to take her running for office seriously. After the election was won, she went on to complete a fairly successful term. After investigating the influence of sexism and socially constructed gender roles on the election, the controversy of whether or not Nellie won her election due to the sympathy of her voters is exposed and discussed. Many have opposed Nellie and her run, but shown by the results of her election, it did not matter. Nellie was faced with a constant uphill battle and several difficulties throughout her election, including the sexism of her peers and the limitations and boundaries of the era's socially constructed gender roles. Even with all those who opposed her and believed she would not be able to make it because of her gender, she still managed to get elected and run a very successful term. Then after her term ended, Nellie attempted a re-election. However, it was unsuccessful, but it did not slow her down, and she instead became the first woman director of the U.S. Mint. Then many years later, she died at the age of 101 in Washington, D.C. on December 20th, 1977. Looking at a photo of Nellie in her later years, posed for a newspaper article celebrating the 100th birthday of our nation's first woman governor. Nellie sits in the chair, alone now, but just as tall and proud with a confident smile across her face. Being recognized once again, even decades later, for her great accomplishments, and the mark she left behind, providing evidence that women have the ability to do anything, and should never feel constricted to the roles society places on them. Nellie will be remembered, not for her husband's death, but for her major role as the first woman in history to be elected a governor of the United States.